Hello and welcome back to the Antiques Airshow, Tales from the Hangar. In this episode, we take a look at a program from an early aviation meeting and through it, delve into the history behind one of Britain's first aviation pioneers. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Tales from the Hangar. And you might be wondering, what is Tales from the Hangar? When I normally do a normal video, I will stumble across an image or a video that I find really interesting. It has a really interesting backstory to it, but when I make my normal videos, I don't have the scope to explore or expand on those particular stories. And that's what Tales from the Hangar is all about. It's going into an archive, into a museum, into my own personal collection, and finding objects, images, books, whatever it may be, and explaining the stories and the tales that exist behind it in a little bit more detail. So without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Today's object comes from my own personal collection. It was given to me by my grandfather. As we can see, it's an official program from an aerial meeting at Hendon Aerodrome on August 17th, 1912. Now in 1912, aviation was still very much in its infancy. Only a few years prior had they had the very first air races, and in June of 1912, the very first aerial derby occurred at Hendon Aerodrome. The aerial derby proved to be extremely popular, with it being believed that 45,000 people paid tickets to get into Hendon Aerodrome to watch the start and the end of the race, while around the 81-mile course, it is believed that 500,000 people lined the streets and turned their heads skyward to watch the race unfold. There was a real fascination and something special about aviation during this time period. The aerial derby would become an annual event in the lead up to the First World War, and weekend flying displays like the one this program is from would become a regular event throughout the year. As one author described it, in the lead up to World War I, it would prove, quote, to be the greatest attraction in London, end quote. Now we flick through the program, there are a few pages of interest. To begin with, the front page has a nice picture of Gustav Hamel demonstrating his plane. From here, the first page is an index, which is then followed by a short history of Hendon Aerodrome. Interestingly, throughout the program, it is actually referred to as London Aerodrome. Following on the next few pages, we have a program of the day, which in order was Event number 1, Grand Speed Handicap, Preliminary Heats. Exhibition and passenger flights were next, and then event number 2, the altitude contest. After this was event number 3, the final of the Grand Speed Handicap, and to finish the day off, exhibition and passenger flights. As we keep going through the program, there is a nice aerial photo of Hendon Aerodrome with markers pointing at the major buildings, and on the following page is a list of the officers of the meeting. We also have a single page dedicated to all the pilots displaying and the type of aircraft they are displaying in. In the center of the book, there is 2 pages dedicated to writing in the results of each race. In the second half of the book, there is information regarding signals and a London Aerodrome notice board. Furthermore, there are plenty of advertisements throughout the program. The last major page of the program is on the very back, and it is an outline with a map, the best way to get to Hendon. For a more detailed look at the program, it is recommended that you go back and pause the video on each page. But there is one name throughout the program that keeps coming up, and that is the name of Grahame-White. And that is because Claude Grahame-White, by 1912, wasn't just a nobody. He was extremely famous, a celebrity of aviation at this time. And that's who I'm going to focus on today. I want to have a bit of a look into the story behind one of England's first pioneer aviators, Claude Grahame-White. Born on the 21st of August 1879 in Basildon, Hampshire, to parents John Reginald White and Ada Beatrice White near Chinook, Claude Grahame-White spent his childhood being educated at Crondall House School and then Bedford Grammar School. At the age of 16, he left school to undertake an apprenticeship in engineering, and it wasn't long before he had developed a keen interest in automobiles, a technology at the time that was still in its infancy. And in 1897 was a founding member of Frederick Sims Automobile Club of Great Britain and Ireland. Around the similar time, he formed Yorkshire Motor Vehicle Company However, as skilled drivers were few and far between, this venture failed to take off. As the new century dawned, Grahame-White managed to land a job for wealthy landowner George Wilder, being tasked with buying new cars for him and his wife and then teaching them how to drive them. After a few years with George Wilder, Grahame-White moved briefly to South Africa. However, after about 9 months, he had returned to Britain, where he had set up his own car dealership, importing and selling cars from France. This was around 1907, a time where aviation was just beginning to take off. As part of his new business, he had to undertake travels to France, and on one such trip in 1908 coincided with a flying demonstration being made by Wilbur Wright, in which Grahame-White was witness to. Then, in 1909, Grahame-White was present for the Reims aviation meeting in which Louis Blériot was demonstrating. By now, Blériot was world famous, having earlier in the year achieved the first flight across the English Channel. It would seem that by now Grahame-White had begun to turn his focus towards the sky, as during the meeting he met with Blériot and an agreement was reached that Blériot would sell the Type 12 he was flying at the meeting to Grahame-White immediately following the conclusion of the demonstration. However, upon landing, Blériot crashed the machine and thus Grahame-White never was delivered the aircraft. Instead, he was promised a brand new Type 12. On November 7th, 1909, after personally helping to build the machine, Grahame-White took delivery of his first aircraft. He quickly tried it out, making a series of short flights in it before beginning his official flight training at Blériot's flying school. But it wasn't long until the machine was written off, when towards the end of November, Blériot, with Grahame-White on board as a passenger, crashed the aircraft. As a result, Blériot offered Grahame-White two of the Type 11. On the 4th of January 1910, Grahame-White was awarded with Aviator Certificate number 30 from Aero Club de France, and in doing so became the first British flyer to receive a French or international pilot certificate. This was shortly followed with a British license, license number 6, issued by the Royal Aero Club in April of the same year. With his license, Grahame-White set out to make a name for himself. Supposedly as early as 1910, he had hired a press agent to ensure that his name was well publicised, and he had opened up a flying school in Pau, France. 1910 was also the year that the Daily Mail had organised, for the time, the longest air race in history between London and Manchester, with a £10,000 prize up for grabs. Having now purchased a Farman 3 biplane, Grahame-White set his eyes on the prize. He and Frenchman Louis Poulon were the only entrants, and on April 27, 1910, the competition began. To highlight the popularity of aviation at the time, the event was widely reported on throughout England and France, and crowds of spectators turned their heads skywards to watch the race. The French president was kept up to date, and the British Parliament were often interrupted with progress reports. After falling behind early on in the race, Grahame-White decided to take a gamble in order to catch up and give himself any shot at winning the race. He would make a night flight, something never done before in England. And in this he was successful, although engine trouble would cut the flight short, and ultimately it was all in vain as Poulon went on to win. But the event, watched and monitored by many, would turn Grahame-White into a celebrity and throw him into the limelight. For the rest of 1910, Grahame-White would tour around attending various meets and competitions, and it is said that during this time he collected some more than $75,000 in prize money. In September, he landed in America, being specifically chosen by J.V. Martin of the Harvard Aeronautical Society to fly in the Boston Harvard meet, where he won the Blue Ribbon event, claiming the $10,000 prize, as well as proving to be extremely popular among the crowds. From here, he moved to New York and won the International Aviation Cup for Britain. Supposedly in one incident, Grahame-White also managed to put his aircraft down on West Executive Avenue in Washington, D.C., not far from the White House, and such was his popularity, the feat was applauded rather than frowned upon. Back in England, his time as a racer would come to an end when in December 1910 he was injured in a crash. He decided to turn his attention to developing London's first aerodrome, and in early 1911 put a lease down for 207 acres of land near Hendon, London. Hendon Aerodrome was born. His flying school was moved there, and not long later, the Grahame-White Aviation Company was set up. The Grahame-White Aviation Company, throughout its time, built a mixture of their own designs and other aircraft manufacturers' designs under license. Grahame-White saw the possible potential of the aircraft as a military weapon, and by 1911 had begun writing and publishing documents about Britain's vulnerability from the air. In May 1911, he conducted a demonstration in front of defence staff of dropping flour bombs onto the outline of a battleship, and he would continue to write on the topic throughout the Second World War. With the outbreak of World War I, Hendon Aerodrome was requisitioned under the Defence of the Realm Act and was transformed into a Royal Naval Air Service station. The Grahame-White Company, located on the base, was also put straight into work, first working on aircraft repairs before receiving their first production order in October 1914, receiving orders to produce the BE-2C. By August 1915, supposedly the company had swelled out to 1,000 employees, and in 1916 a new factory was built at Hendon. Expansion would continue throughout the war as more orders arrived, with the company reportedly expanding out to 50 acres. Grahame-White was also not far from the action, joining the Royal Naval Air Service and earning a commission. With the threats of Zeppelins on the 5th-6th of September 1914, he participated in the first night patrol over London. However, as production grew at his factory, he resigned his commission to allow himself to focus solely on aircraft production. And while the Grahame-White Aviation Company produced a variety of aircraft under licenses, it wasn't without difficulties. Issues arose with orders and the government, raw materials were hard to come by, production slowed down, and debt began mounting after borrowing heavily from both his uncle and the Admiralty. This would take its toll on Grahame-White, who in December 1917 was admitted to hospital for 6 weeks following a nervous breakdown. Things would not get easier either for the company. With the war's end in November 1918, all aircraft production contracts were cancelled, leaving the company without any business. One hangar was converted into an auction room to sell war surplus, while the other factory was kept going with furniture making, and eventually in 1920, Grahame-White Aviation Company was rebranded Grahame-White Limited, and aircraft production came to a complete end. The rebranded company would focus on automobile production, in a way signalling a full circle in life for Grahame-White. Still though, this venture would prove to bear few fruits, and in 1924 production had been stopped. Following the end of the war, the Admiralty still had control of Hendon Airfield, and this control was passed on to the newly formed Royal Air Force in 1919. There was refusal from the government to hand back the airfield to Grahame-White, and in 1922 an ugly legal stouch between the government and Grahame-White erupted. It wouldn't be until 1925 that the case would finally come to an end, with the airfield formally becoming the possession of the Royal Air Force. For Grahame-White, this essentially ended his career and interest in aviation. He moved overseas, living abroad and investing in property throughout the US and the UK. In 1959, at the age of 79, he passed away in Nice, France. And that brings us to an end to the story of one of Britain's first aviators. Grahame-White was a celebrity of his time, helping to showcase the very latest in aviation technology, pushing those boundaries, but perhaps more importantly, he helped commercialize and consolidate aviation within Britain. For Hendon Aerodrome, it would be utilised extensively as a Royal Air Force base up to and until the end of the Second World War. Post the Second World War, it would see flying activities decrease until they came to a complete stop in the late 1960s. The base was officially closed in 1987. From here, the aerodrome was redeveloped into commercial and civil uses, and is no longer used as an aerodrome. Still though, through the RAF Museum Hendon, the Royal Air Force still keep presence on the former site, and one of the exhibit halls at the RAF Museum Hendon is an old factory from the Grahame-White Aviation Company. This booklet is a reminder, a souvenir perhaps, of those early days of aviation, the days of experimentation and fascination. It is also a reminder of what Grahame-White was achieving and doing for aviation in Britain during the time period. a showman, a businessman, showcasing the latest in aviation technology.